fallen patriotism. As Americans marked their nation's 244th birthday early this month, an alarming new poll exposed how they feel about being American. Patriotism in the US has fallen to its lowest point in 2 decades, according to Gallup. In fact, only 45% of Americans say they are extremely proud to be American, the lowest point in US patriotism since 2001. By contrast, 70% of Americans were extremely proud to be American in 2003. What has happened since then?
Are you proud to be an American?
Not especially.
Are you proud to be an American?
At the moment, no.
Why not?
Donald Trump.
Everyone sold the American dream of freedom and liberty and doing what you want to, but like when you look at the news and you see that there are plenty of people who are restricted of those freedoms, it makes you upset about what you've been sold, and it seems like kind of a lie.
America, in a way, is the land of selfishness to the extreme.
The record low patriotism comes at a time when the US faces a public health crisis brought on by the coronavirus pandemic and civil unrest following the death of George Floyd in police custody. This 4th of July saw some anti-racist protesters setting American flags on fire and tearing down Confederate statues across the country. Why are Americans taking less and less pride in being American? What has caused the decline in American patriotism?
I do think that what has happened recently is a perfect storm. It's a combination of 3 things. The first is that Donald Trump is the president, and he's a very divisive president, and that will tend to deflate people's hopes and their optimism and their pride when they feel that their country, and so I'm speaking of the left here, when they feel that their country has been hijacked by somebody whose intentions for the country are not to unite it but to divide it. The second thing is the coronavirus pandemic, which this administration was in no way prepared to deal with. It's very clear that that was outside of anything that they had imagined, and that they have had a very difficult time dealing with it. And then the third is the murder of George Floyd.
The idea of America in decline suggests that President Trump's campaign promise of making America great again has fallen flat.
This, in fact, is our new American moment. There has never been a better time to start living the American dream. So to every citizen watching at home tonight, no matter where you've been or where you've come from, this is your time. If you work hard, if you believe in yourself, if you believe in America, then you can dream anything. You can be anything.
People of a country usually come together during times of crisis, but this isn't happening in America right now. Some Americans say they need to re-examine their history. President Trump says no.
Make no mistake, this left-wing cultural revolution is designed to overthrow the American Revolution.
President Trump appears more willing than ever to delve deeper into culture wars and to deploy racism as his weapon of choice. With over 4 months until the election, will stoking division pay off for Trump? It did help him get elected in 2016. Will it work in 2020? Trump is convinced that divisive rhetoric meant to energize his core of white supporters is the key to re-election victory.
There is a big difference between this election and the election of 2016. In 2016, nobody knew what kind of president Donald Trump would be, and I'm sure there were many people who disliked Hillary Clinton who would be willing to take a chance, if you will, on Donald Trump. But now there's no doubt in anyone's mind as to what kind of president he is and would continue to be. And I do think that Americans they're weary and fatigued of all this division.
Positioning himself as presiding over a civil war, Trump has promised to defeat what he calls the radical left through the aggressive use of law enforcement.
We are now in the process of defeating the radical left, the Marxists, the anarchists, the agitators, the looters, and people who, in many instances, have absolutely no clue what they are doing.
Trump sees himself as the guardian of American history, characterizing anti-racist protesters as a fascist mob that is determined to end America by erasing its history and indoctrinating its children.
I am here as your president to proclaim before the country and before the world, this monument will never be desecrated. These heroes will never be defaced. Their legacy will never, ever be destroyed. Their achievements will never be forgotten. And Mount Rushmore will stand forever as an eternal tribute to our forefathers and to our freedom.
Such rhetoric is designed to inflame and divide the public, not unite it. Although the strategy proved successful in the 2016 election, America's national mood, as well as Trump's sinking poll numbers, suggest it may not work in 2020.
Since your question is whether or not the language that Trump has chosen, and it has grown increasingly extreme, whether or not this is likely to appeal to the current mood of the voters, then the answer is no. Clearly, if the election were held tomorrow, Trump would lose.
As America plunges deeper into crisis, Trump has adopted the dual strategy of stoking racial divides while minimizing the threat of the coronavirus pandemic. Trump spent the Independence Day holidays raging about the need to protect statues of past figures who supported slavery and white supremacy.
Our nation is witnessing a merciless campaign to wipe out our history, defame our heroes, erase our values, and indoctrinate our children. Angry mobs are trying to tear down statues of our founders, deface our most sacred memorials, and unleash a wave of violent crime in our cities.
That could all be an attempt at distracting the public's attention away from a frightening spike in coronavirus cases. Cities across America's South and West, where support for Trump has traditionally been strong, are getting pummeled by the COVID-19.
I don't think it's a distraction, but I do think that both the pandemic and the move to take down the monuments, that actually does hurt Donald Trump's base, because his rhetoric and his base was racist from the beginning.
Trump continued gaslighting Americans about the threat to their health with a dangerously misleading claim that 99% of coronavirus cases are harmless. Encouraging Americans to ignore the deadly risks of the pandemic, which has killed about 140,000 people, is a stunning departure from the president's duty to keep Americans safe and protect the public health. The World Health Organization has said that 20% of all COVID-19 patients are sick enough to need oxygen or hospital care. Is Trump putting his personal political interests above American lives?
I believe that many people know that Trump puts personal interests above the interests of the country, and that bothers some people, but it doesn't bother everyone. His base doesn't seem to mind if Trump uses the presidency, for example, to improve his brand, to make himself wealthier. These sorts of things that really are unprecedented in the history of the American presidency.
Polls have consistently shown that the American people are not buying into President Trump's narrative on the public health and civil unrest crises. Trump currently has the worst polling numbers any presidential incumbent has had at this point in the race in nearly 3 decades. Trump is losing the support of crucial parts of his base, like older and white voters, as the pandemic wreaks havoc on their health and income. A Reuters Ipsos poll has found that just 37% of Americans approve of the president's response to the coronavirus.
Well, Donald Trump needs to stop caring about how he looks and start caring about what is happening to the rest of America. The number of cases is increasing in 29 states. We're going to be dealing with this for a long time. Trump can't wish it away. He can't bend it to meet his political wishes. There are no miracles coming.
Trump is not on the winning side of the culture war either. According to a recent Quinnipiac University poll, a majority of Americans now support removing Confederate statues. A CBS News poll has also found that 8 in 10 Americans believe the Black Lives Matter movement will help change the way police treat minorities. As voters reject Trump on race issues and the coronavirus, his Democratic rival, former Vice President Joe Biden, takes a commanding lead over the Republican president.
I do think that a lot of people will vote for Joe Biden who don't particularly have confidence in Joe Biden. Rather, they will go to the polls to vote against Donald Trump.
Biden is ahead of Trump by 14 percentage points, attracting 50% of the vote compared with 36% for Trump. That's according to a national poll by the New York Times.
I think that Donald Trump has had a very difficult challenge in front of him. One of those challenges was of his own making, and that in particular, the murder of George Floyd and the unrest that was set off by that, that challenge would have been much more easily met by a different president.
President Trump's language and policies seem to be out of touch, not only with most Americans, but even much of the Republican Party. Trump's conduct is creating a dilemma for the GOP as his support wanes with the public. A number of current and former Republican officials are organizing to defeat the president and elect his Democratic opponent, Biden.
We're building this group from the grassroots up. And so our goal is exactly what you said, to elect Joe Biden. We know how to talk to Republicans. We're a group made up of Republicans and independents and some Democrats as well. And we're asking all Americans to come together and vote for Joe Biden, because Donald Trump is a threat to our nation. He is a threat to our Constitution, and he is a danger to our national security and to our national health.
Many Republicans have long been uncomfortable with Trump's divisive rhetoric. The question they're facing now is whether to stand by in silence as Trump continues to endanger public health and divide the nation. With American lives and identity on the line, the GOP silence could become complicity. Are Republicans ready to pay the price at the ballot box for keeping silent?
As time goes on, as the pandemic persists, and as the public unrest over race issues, as it continues and hasn't dissipated at this point, as that goes on, it becomes more and more difficult for Republicans to stay silent. And so there are many Republicans running for office who simply aren't mentioning Donald Trump. Instead, they've gone into vague generalities about being solid conservatives and this sort of thing.
The picture coming out of the decline in American patriotism, coupled with Trump's sliding poll numbers and a frightened Republican Party, is that America is perhaps getting ready to reject a president who has failed the biggest tests of his presidency. US involved in Afghan drug trafficking. For many years, opium derived from Afghanistan's vast poppy fields has been smuggled into other countries. The Taliban militant group, which had once banned poppy cultivation, now heavily relies on opium trafficking as its main source of income.
The reason it's so significant is that it builds a war chest for the Taliban. 60% of their income to buy guns and bombs and to recruit their fighters comes from the opium trade.
But the militants lack resources needed to smuggle opium and launder the dirty money it generates. Moscow says the United States has been giving the Taliban a lending hand. Russia's special envoy for Afghanistan, Zamir Kabulov, has accused US intelligence officers of being involved in drug trafficking from the war-torn country. Kabulov recently said, "Those wonderful US intelligence officers who accuse us of different things are involved in drug trafficking. Their planes from Kandahar, from Bagram airfield near Kabul, are flying wherever they want to Germany, to Romania, without any inspections." The US has a history of teaming up with drug traffickers in other countries.
It certainly would not be the first time. We know that the US government, the CIA, engaged in drug trafficking to support its allies in the Vietnam War, and ended up with, tens of thousands of US soldiers who served in Vietnam ending up as drug addicts, coming back to the United States as drug addicts. The United States facilitated the sale of cocaine, widespread sale of cocaine in the 1980s as part of its strategy to fund the Contras, the counter-revolutionaries against the Sandinista government there.
The Soviet intervention in Afghanistan in the 1970s expanded the theater of operations for CIA officials willing to partner with Afghan drug lords fighting the Soviets. US funds, on top of an expanding opium harvest, sustained the Afghan militancy throughout the Cold War. By the mid-1980s, CIA officers would contact trucks in Pakistan to send weapons to Afghanistan and return with heroin. Experts say the CIA helped transform the Afghan-Pakistan frontier into a launchpad for the global heroin trade.
There was always, or at least for a long time, the widespread growing of poppies for heroin, opium production, and so forth.
The US first intervened in Afghanistan allegedly as a pushback against the Soviet occupation of the country.
Recently, there has been another very serious development which threatens the maintenance of the peace in Southwest Asia. Massive Soviet military forces have invaded the small, non-aligned, sovereign nation of Afghanistan.
For a decade, the US gave Afghan mujahideen, who would later form the backbone of terrorist forces in the country, an estimated $3 billion worth of weaponry. The CIA also helped the Afghan warlords launder opium money through the agency's shell companies and friendly banks in the Middle East.
One of the most closely guarded secrets of the Cold War was America's role in supporting Afghan warlords known as the Mujahideen. The official story is that America backed these fundamentalists in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979. But that's not true. It was 6 months before the Soviet invasion, in July of that year, that President Jimmy Carter authorized $500 million to help set up the Mujahideen, a terrorist organization.
The goal of the US intervention, in the words of Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was to give the Soviet Union its own Vietnam.
I mean, you can hardly imagine a more horrible thing than another Vietnam War when you consider the millions who died, the destruction of so much of the country and so forth. And here, Brzezinski in 1998 is proudly saying that that's what he wanted to do. And I say this, we should recall that it wasn't until December 1979 that the Soviet Union intervened in Afghanistan at the request of the government of Afghanistan, because it was being destroyed and dismantled by these counter-revolutionary forces with the full backing of the United States.
The Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan in the late 1980s. So did the United States. But the US returned to Afghanistan in 2001 under the pretext of overthrowing the Taliban regime. What does that say about the US policy in Afghanistan? Returning to overthrow a militancy it had helped create in the first place?
The ultimate in cynicism and hypocrisy that the US really made it possible for those forces to come to power in the 1990s, then went to war against them in 2001, after the World Trade Center attacks.
A year before the 2001 US invasion of Afghanistan, the Taliban had outlawed opium production in an apparent appeal for international recognition. A UN survey of over 10,000 villages found at the time that the ban had reduced the opium harvest by more than 90%, causing a temporary crash in the global heroin market. Following the US invasion, the opium production soon went through the roof.
After the United States and its coalition partners went into Afghanistan, the amount of opium and heroin that was being produced shot up to 180 metric tons, and it went to 3,000 metric tons. And within 3 years, it had increased by 8,000 metric tons. In 2016, 2017, we had a record number of opium and heroin being produced in the country of Afghanistan. It went up to 9,000 metric tons, which is the highest number in the history of Afghanistan.
Why hasn't the US tried to stop Afghanistan's opium production?
I think that there was about perhaps a combination of motivations for the US not to do anything to stop the drug trafficking once it had taken over the country, occupied the country. And in fact could have had reasons, as they did in Nicaragua or in Vietnam, in Laos, to use drug trafficking as a way to finance elements that they were supporting in the war.
Today, Afghanistan is the source of about 90% of the world's heroin. The drug trade is the Taliban's cash cow. It finances the militants and pays for the weapons they use to fight American and Afghan security forces. Analysts say Afghanistan will continue to be a haven for militants unless the opium trade is snuffed out. But the US has never had a counter-narcotics strategy for Afghanistan. Instead, Washington has negotiated a peace deal with the Taliban.
The United States has not found a way to get out of Afghanistan. It's much easier to go in to a country in the occupation, I think, that they found out many times, than it is to find a way out.
The opium cultivation persists in Afghanistan. The Taliban control more territory. Civilian life is overwhelmed by violence. And America is negotiating with the same militants it went to war with. What does the United States have to show for its longest war in history?